Thank you. Thank you very much for coming out. Like you said, I work at Mozilla. We like open source stuff, and we're here to talk about open source and specifically open source security solutions and how they play in an enterprise role. So the agenda here, basically we're going to talk about you've only got so much money for things like blinky boxes, consultants, stuff like that. So it seemed like open source could help here, right? So what's working, what's holding people back, and mostly what this is a precursor for is Mozilla's working on a set of initiatives to help kind of curate a set of open source solutions to common security problems. And so these are some of the items that we'll hit on in this talk. Oops. Hey. Slides aren't working. So we hit on some problems, things like money. We're going to talk about where commercial stuff may win. We're going to talk about open source. There are some places where open source clearly is winning. Then we're going to also talk about problems with open source, potential solutions. I'm going to hit on 5 projects you may not know about that probably could help you maybe today, maybe tomorrow when you get back in the office, or Monday when you get back in the office. Then last, we're going to wrap up with how you can help. First, I have to talk about how this is not a talk about browsers. Yes, I work at a company that makes browsers. This is a presentation being made from a browser, and they're great, but this is not a talk about browsers. We're going to talk about everything except browsers. So this summer, I got a new boss. This is a picture of my boss. This is not a picture of my boss. But he asked me what Mozilla could do to help solve the world's security problems. He's kind of a big thinker using open source. Mozilla loves open source, so this is Mozilla GitHub repo. You can see the frightening numbers that we have there, the 1,900 something repositories. We've got roughly 1,000 people, some of whom work at Mozilla, some of whom don't, 400 something teams, so we do open source by default. Matter of fact, our default data classification at Mozilla is public, so everything you create is public stuff. So that's great, we like open source, but how can we help here exactly, right? So my boss and I agreed to use the remaining bits of 2018 to do some experiments, bring some science to this work and do some focus work in 2019 to help kind of curate open source security solutions. So thanks, you're helping me keep my boss happy and helping me keep on track for 2019, and also help to kind of figure out exactly what curate really means. This is nice. It sounds like a nice word, nice little definition, but what does it really mean to do this kind of work? And more importantly, what does open source need in order to be successful? So we all have budgets to operate in, and I'm curious the slide thing's not working at all. So I'm curious how many people would say that they've got essentially $0, like they have no impact on their budget. It's just like money that happens somehow, and then they're stuck with it, like nothing. There's a couple of people raise their hands in there. So I'm curious how many people would say in the middle of this they've got like enough. They got enough money. They have everything they need. They're happy and satisfied. Okay, a nice smattering. And then the end of the spectrum there, how many people would say they have too much money? Like I wish I could give my money to somebody else, and I wouldn't have to worry about spending it. At the end of the year comes up, I got to go find new ways to spend money. I have to invent things that don't even exist, problems that aren't real. No, nobody really has that problem. Okay, great. The real question here is that if open source is the end-all, be-all, how come everyone isn't using it and saving all the money that they would spend on blinky boxes and vendors and consultants and go do something more fun like take exotic vacations, things like that? There are some clear spaces, though, when you look at kind of the inventory of open source stuff, where there seems to be very little open source coverage, and so therefore commercial stuff clearly wins. So things like database security, there are some packages that kind of help with database security, but nothing's as complete as the commercial stuff that's out there. Email security, especially not spam assassin sort of stuff, I mean, it wins there, but it's become vendor packaged. But things like DKIM, stuff like that, there's nothing really that kind of can take that space in email. And then there's probably a debate about the AV, antivirus space. We'll get into some survey results that talk about that specifically. So if we're going to talk about problems with open source, we first need to understand, or if we're going to talk about solving problems with open source, we first need to understand the problems with open source. It's a symbiotic relationship. So one of the easiest ways to find out what folks are struggling with was to ask them. We've got this program at Mozilla that I was lucky enough to be able to help kind of kick off. We call it the culture of experimentation. Somebody said once, I'm going to mess up the quote, but if you're not doing controlled experiments on a subset of your users, you are by definition doing an uncontrolled experiment on the entirety of your user base. And so the culture of experiments is all about shifting the needle of that. So you're doing small things, you can fail quickly, you can get some insights, then you can do larger versions of those things and hopefully not upset your entire user base all at once just because you thought something was a great idea. So one of the things that came out of that is that surveys are cheap. And they are a great way to get data. If you have no idea where to start, just ask people because they'll tell you. They've got lots of information, especially in this space, in open source. People have beat their head against problems for a long time, and they wish someone would ask them. So we did a survey looking for like what's in use, what's not, what sort of barriers and stuff were out there. This is just a smattering of this. And so the first thing that we found out is that open source definitely is in play. I was expecting these numbers to be way, way, way more skewed than they are in this slide. It's pretty much 50-50. It went back and forth depending on the kind of the communities that I queried in there. So I sent this out mostly just to kind of my social circles, like so mailing list, Slack channels, Twitter, that kind of stuff. So very scientific, right? But it was interesting. I mean, I think we got some good information. So the curious part of this is that it wasn't just open source, right? Do you use Nmap? I think probably everybody has used Nmap. It counts as an open source. But the question was more about do you use open source as a significant part of your information security program, meaning you are relying on open source to give you some capability, and you made a purposeful decision to not choose a commercial vendor product as a result. And like you said, it's kind of a 50-50 sort of a split. So there are definitely some winners or some things that are used and useful in open source. And so how that kind of breaks out, you've got your IDS categories. So Bro, which by the way has changed its name to Zeek. So if you've been saying Bro, you're gonna have to learn to say Zeek instead, like Zeek and ye shall find. Snort, Suricata, so the IDSs of the world, especially were well represented in that list of folks who do use open source stuff. And then there's kind of the log scenario, right? How do you get logs from one place to another? Syslog actually was never mentioned, even though it's open source, and it's probably the place all this stuff that comes from. Syslog, syslog-ng, rsyslog, those kind of things. But the things that kind of grab that and make it into something like elk, Graylog, FluentD, though, as a log shipper, got mentioned in there. So log categories is another one that people definitely make use of open source, which makes sense. And then endpoint stuff started to show up, which was interesting. This is kind of where the antivirus question comes into play. So OS query was mentioned a lot as a thing that people use. GER came up, surprising. I hadn't really heard of many people with a successful GER implementation, but it did come up. And then there were some mentions in there also of ClamAV specifically as a antivirus implementation. And then there was some mention of kind of got lumped together in like the scanner sort of category, right? So Nikto, Nmap, Zap, just like a kind of one-off sort of scanner sort of thing. So it's interesting because you've got everything down from like a kind of the thing you'd have to implement and know that's going to be up 99% of the time, like a Bro or an IDS sort of system, to a one-off thing. I'm just going to Nmap scan something. So you can see open source is being successful in all the various categories. So one of the really interesting things is start to ask people what their challenges are. So this was the question, right? So what do you think the greatest barriers are felt by enterprises considering using open source scenarios in there? And so this is the way the questions went out there, and the results were super interesting. So we've got everything from functionality gaps to don't know what kind of things exist out there. Not surprisingly, lack of support was one of the top things in there. One of the respondents noted that open source is sometimes more of a science experiment, right? It's like it's not exactly something that's fully baked, and especially starts to fall over if you try to implement it at some kind of scale beyond what the author happened to have access to. So if somebody wrote it and they were in an environment of 10 people, it pretty much works for 10 people and it won't work for anything else. So we're not going to dive into the support issue specifically here. I think probably the next thing to do is actually take each one of these and break them out into their own survey to figure out exactly what kind of issues people are dealing with now that we know the general categories and how they play. Also the ones that kind of didn't show up at all, like how to do feature customizations or how to contribute to projects didn't show up, that kind of stuff. But let's dive into some of the specific challenges that are here. So survey respondents noted that a part of the problem is knowing what exists. So long-standing projects like Snort, Bro, Suricata, Nmap, Metasploit, we've all heard of those things, right? And they benefit from having sort of a tribal knowledge. When we come to conferences like this, we can talk to people about, hey, what are you doing with Bro or Zeek or Suricata? And then as well as there's some coverage of all of those tools in various certifications. You go to a SANS class, you're going to learn about some of that kind of stuff, for example. New projects, they have maybe some exposure for things like demo labs at DEF CON, or there's the Arsenal series at Black Hat, but they'll get almost no coverage from the press unless they're backed by some large company. So if you're a Facebook or a Google and you open source something, that comes with a press tour and briefings and announcements and those kind of things. But if you're just, someone wrote a thing, put it on GitHub, those are really your only chances to get something out there. So if you're an open source project that's solving a unique problem, you've got a high barrier before even folks understand that you exist, right, what's out there. So what we do tend to do in open source is make lists. Let's see if my slide thing works this time. Nope. So let's go back. It's supposed to go one by one, but it doesn't. So the one on the top there is the one that, at least when I ran into it, looked the most feature complete. It's nowhere.net. They have a little bit of a split personality. It's a great site. I'm not knocking the site at all. But they talk about penetration testing, security auditing tools, and cyberpunk, but they'll also cover sort of defensive stuff and all that. And I should say these slides, the other thing that's not working is the bottom actually has the address for the slides, which is on my website. Anyways, we'll get this stuff out. This is actually already live on the internet, which is why I'm presenting from a browser. So anyways, all this stuff will be available, is available now. Just make sure the links and stuff get out. So the second one begins the list of awesome lists. There's this whole awesome list section on GitHub. So the second one on there is awesome incident response. And then we've got awesome machine learning, even for cybersecurity. Then we've got one specializing in awesome threat detection. Then we get into awesome forensics. We get into more general, awesome security. It gets more general as we go down. There's just the awesome list, everything that's awesome. And then there's the list of lists, just to kind of round it all out. So what we do for open source security is definitely we make lists. We make lists of lists. We make awesome lists of awesome lists, on and on. So one thing we don't do in open source, a lot of, in the commercial space, a lot of product reviews will come with in-depth reviews, comparisons, right? We'll kind of do a deep dive. SC Magazine, for example, exists, it seems like, solely to review yet another project or product, then compare them against each other, compare them against the previous year, that sort of thing. And then you've seen things like this that take it to an extreme, and they'll add categorizations, take all the vendors and kind of lay them out just like this. SANS even has on the back of their posters that they send out. They got a way to categorize all the vendors into various categories and tools and things like that. Seems like a thing that we are missing. So maybe what we should do in open source is build upon things like this. To help maybe add some framework. So this is the cyber defense matrix. Has anyone heard of the cyber defense matrix? Just a couple. Okay. This is really cool. This is an OASP project from Sunil, I think is at Bank of America. I think he's one of the ones behind it. So it's simply a framework, right? It's a way to organize your thoughts. It's not a way to solve security by any means. But what it does do is just take the NIST cybersecurity framework, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, lays that out across the top, and then lays across the side angle things that you're talking about. So if you are a person trying to plan out your security program, you could use this to say, do I have a tool? Do I have a way to identify devices? Do I have a way to identify things on my network, right? And then you could move across that to kind of identify other gaps in your particular security program, right? So do I need something to help me detect whatever data crossing my network or whatever? So you can use that to sort of plan out either gaps in your your security program or places that you need to improve or talk about your successes, that kind of thing. So it's just a framework to kind of get there. So maybe one of the first things, this is an idea, it's totally experimental. Like I said, my boss wants me to experiment, so here we are experimenting. So maybe one of the first things that Mozilla could help with is to curate open source solutions is to inventory them. Right, so here's a work in progress application. This is a director level code here, so don't expect anything great. To catalog open source tools. So the idea was take the existing list. We've got plenty of lists. We know where all the open source stuff is. And then maybe add some tags in there to allow them to categorize the function. You'll notice the function.identify, recover, things like that according to the cybersecurity matrix. and then maybe get a better idea, not necessarily a vendor logo map sort of thing, but at least a searchable kind of thing that would help you figure out, oh, I heard about Siphon at a security conference. What's it do? Oh, it does these things, and maybe we could detail some other stuff about the stack. It maybe uses Redis or Mongo, or it's written in Java or Python or things like that. Then you've got more information rather than just a list that these things are all awesome. They're all in the same list because they're all super awesome. And then the idea and the way the app works, and this app is live as well, and if I wasn't having these problems with the slide, I would show you a little bit more, but I'm having some video issues. But the idea is that you can then use all those things to tag or to select the things that you're looking for, and then you get a list, right? So it's like, hey, I want to find anything that's in these categories, and then you can get a list of all the stuff that's out there. So the other thing that respondents said, one of the big bar items on the list, is that it's super hard to tell in open source if a project is healthy enough to use and rely on. So great, you can find the code. Awesome, now I got the code. What's next, right? Is this a thing that I'm going to plan my whole security program around? Is this a thing I need to need some help, need some love? It's got some issues. Where does it sit on the spectrum? So here's an example of what I think is a healthy project, right? So this is just the GitHub stat stuff. If you read down in the README, way below, it doesn't include actual references to production employments. There's some Fortune X level companies using it. But if you look at just the GitHub stats itself, it's got 191 releases. That's amazing. That's a lot of releases. It's got active commits like 2 hours ago or 2 days ago, something like that. It's got plenty of stars, if you like stars. It's got plenty of forks, if you like forks. It's got branches. It's got everything. It's even got issues. It's got all kinds of stuff going on. So here's another one. And this one's harder to tell, right? It's not as much. It has 0 releases. It has the last commit was 6 years ago, but maybe it's done. Maybe it's feature complete. Maybe this thing, it's just a honeypot program, so maybe someone wrote the best honeypot you've ever seen, and it's perfect right out of the batch. It only had one or 3 commits to it, and it's perfectly done. Super hard to tell, right? Whether something is maybe unloved, maybe also it doesn't work. I don't know. It's hard to tell. So the other part, the other idea for this catalog of apps is that GitHub has a rich API where most open source projects are in GitHub. So maybe there's a way to make use of that to go figure out, are things like releases, commits, is there a healthy balance of open closed issues? And I'm curious if you folks have ideas about that sort of thing. So here's an example of using that API to maybe rate the health of a project based on the number of releases. That's a very simple idea. It just says how many releases do you have. If you have more than X, then maybe you're healthy. If you have less than X, you're something else. And if you are a data sciencey sort of person, I would love your ideas about how to do that in a more non-director code level sort of way. So then the idea is that with this health rating as well, you could also use something like that super easy pivot table kind of thing to not only filter by the rating, the function that you want, but also get an idea of the health of the potential solutions that you may be looking at. And so this is the project that we're talking about. Like I said, I was going to do a demo, but I'm scared of the AV setup. So this is the project out there on GitHub. Of course, you'll have a really hard time telling how healthy it is. There's like 4 commits. There's no releases. There's also no issues, so maybe it's completely feature complete. So if you want to help contribute to this, by all means, please do. And again, the slides and stuff will be out, and you can find all this stuff afterwards, or feel free to have come talk to me afterwards. Okay, so we took a look at the challenges and potential solution areas to do some more work in. So let's pivot a bit, and we're going to take a look at some open source projects that you might not be aware of. You may be aware of them, but probably not, and potentially help you in your information security program. So this is in no particular order. This isn't a beauty contest. This isn't my top 5 list by any means. These are just things that I've run into over a course of time that I don't think are completely knowledgeable in the community. Not everyone knows about them, but I think they do hold a place. And I think in a lot of cases they're unique. They do a thing that no commercial tool does yet. So the first one we're going to talk about is a cloud mapping tool. So this literally is called Cloud Mapper. It's from Duo Labs. Duo Labs is kind of like it says, the labs arm of Duo. And like I said, it's super easy to kind of point this at your AWS environment and downloads a bunch of information about your AWS environment and then shows it to you, like in a way that I don't think I've ever seen anything show it to you at all. And they've got a demo site. If we could see the top of the URL, we could see where the demo site is, but we can't. Anyways, so you can go play with this without actually having to point it at your AWS account. So where this is useful is if, for example, if you're trying to figure out did that CloudFormation template that you just stood up, did it actually create things that you wanted it to make? Did the intern spit up Bitcoin miners they didn't bother to tell you about and then left the company? Or did you remember to turn down that stack of expensive EC2 instances that you wanted to do just for a demo or for a one-off thing or just to see if those things are actually worth it, that kind of stuff. Or if you're doing incident response, it's useful if you're brought into an AWS account, you have no idea, you're trying to get context, right? An easy way to just do that and get maybe a visual idea of something that would have been a lot harder to do just clicking around the never-ending AWS endless list of icons, right? The next one we're going to talk about, so is Cloud Mapper from Dual Labs. Next one we're going to talk about is TLS fingerprinting. Are anyone familiar with the concept, TLS fingerprinting? Just a couple, okay. So we'll dive into, so what it does, and this is JA3 from Salesforce. So there's implementations of it. Salesforce seems to have the one that's kind of captured the mind share, if you will. So the idea is that this is a client hello, right? So clients initiating SSL connection to a server. These are all the things that go on in there. So the idea behind a JA3 fingerprint is that you take the combination of things listed across here, session, cipher, all that, and make it into a fingerprint that uniquely identifies the client that's making that connection. No two clients have different or have the same signature on there. So here's an example of some, just to kind of give you some context for what you can do. So here's the first one is the fingerprint for the standard Tor client. So if you're trying to find Tor in your network, that's what you would look for to see a Tor client making an SSL connection to somewhere. There's one for the Dridex malware. And then, of course, Metasploit, right? Can do the same thing if it's connecting out to SSL. This would be the JA3 fingerprint that you would see for that. So it's useful for finding not only bad things, but also finding good things. So let's say you had an app, like a mobile app, and you had an API on the end of that, and you wanted to know what sort of things were talking to your API. Is it always your app? Is it someone doing account checking, just checking for username, passwords, that kind of stuff? Are there old versions of your app that may not be valid anymore? Or maybe you want to just monitor your own infrastructure for rogue traffic like this. So, and if you've got this kind of, so JA3 comes in Suricata, Zeek. I gotta get used to saying Zeek as well. So if you're taking that stuff and throwing it in, like in this case, Elasticsearch, it's very easy. Just find you can either just search one off, like this case, we're just searching for a week's worth of traffic to see if we've got, in that case, it was Metasploit's interpreter, JA3 fingerprint, and nothing, so that's great. Or you can set up alerts, obviously, on that if you see that kind of traffic in your environment as well. So it's super useful for that kind of thing, and not a thing I think you can get from commercial tooling necessarily. Or if they get it, they're actually just re-implementing JA3. So this next one, this is not unique. As a matter of fact, the speaker earlier was talking about this. So, but there are a couple things unique about this implementation that I thought I would pick up. So this is check pwned. So this is checking against the have I been pwned database for either email or password exposures. The unique thing about this is written in Rust. So Rust, if you haven't looked at it, is a super cool new language. It's becoming the core of a lot of what I said I wasn't going to talk about browsers, but it's the only thing I will talk about with browsers. Is becoming the core of a lot of what Firefox is built on. It's a super great language. It is obtuse and really tough to pick up if you haven't actually tried to do anything. You got a long way to go before you can write a program. I think the reason I'm bringing this up is that this is a great example of a task, and once you see it implemented in Rust, you start to understand Rust a lot better, right? So if you're looking to understand Rust, this is a great way to do it. Just look at the source code for this app because it's really well written, and it accomplishes something that's useful, right? So you can take this, just like it says, you can kind of one-off do either passwords, or you can do email addresses, or you can do a file full of email addresses and just have it do it as like a cron job sort of thing every day, and it'll just go out and search to see if you've got any new breaches on that stuff. So it's a super useful tool. It never sends your password out, if you're worried about that. It uses the k-anonymity mathematical property, so it takes a hash of your password as you type it in, takes the first, I think it's 5 characters of that, sends that off, then gets back anywhere from like, I think it's 30 to 300 different sets of hashes that could match, and then on the client side is where it does that matching. So it's also a super interesting thing to see how that gets implemented in Rust as well. So again, I bring up, in case you're interested in learning Rust, it's a really great project to take a look at. So the next one we'll talk about here, and I think this is the 5th one. So there's a project called Bryner Alert from our friends at Airbnb. So Airbnb not only will rent you a place, they'll also make great security software, if you didn't know. They do a couple of things that people are familiar with, like Stream Alert, but I thought I'd pick on Bryner Alert because it's a really useful thing. So the idea is that if you've got a set of files and you need to go through those files with Yara for signatures, a great idea about doing that would be to just spin up stuff in AWS, right? To do is kind of a one-off task. You don't necessarily always have to do it. So what Binary Alert does is help tame the sort of Rube Goldberg machine that AWS is, and makes it easy to send files to S3 buckets and then scan those things against analyze or a set of Yara signatures that either you have or you made up because you found an infection somewhere, or maybe you got a threat intel feed of Yara signatures coming your way, and do a bunch of different stuff with it. So you can either just send emails to you about it, you can send alerts through a variety of things with that, but nice, super easy way to get that kind of fairly complex AWS infrastructure set up without knowing what you're doing, and just living off the benefit of Airbnb and their engineering time. Sorry, more to go still. So next one I'll bring up is Falco. So Falco is a syscall monitoring tool. So we're talking about syscalls down at the audit sort of level of the Linux system, right? So you open a network port or talk to a file or open a session or that kind of thing. So sysdig they both have a commercial and they have an open source tool. This is the open source version of it. Falco is meant to monitor containers. So if you've got like a Kubernetes infrastructure running a bunch of containers, you run one Falco instance that monitors all those containers simultaneously. And the neat thing about Falco is they've got a really great set of rules written against that. So what you can see in the top is just the Falco instance, and then the bottom is someone using a container, and you can see the rules firing as they go on. So it'll loop back around here in a second. But you can see everything from just there was a session on the container opened. So if a developer gave you a container and they're like, I don't need access to it, it's just fine, I'll never need to look at the thing at all, and you catch them log on to the thing, then you can start to hook this up to rules to say if everyone ever logs into a container, kill it. Want to mark it as tainted, never use it again. Or you can let that kind of stuff go, and you can say, all right, I'll let you get on the box, but if you start doing things like catting out its password or replacing ls with some stuff, and there are also rules written for that. It has a really extensive rule set. It goes on and on and on. It's kind of amazing when you look at it, the amount of things that they've covered. They've even covered for like vulnerability scanners and what they do when they get onto a machine, have whitelisted some of those kind of things. So it's a real good kind of Kickstarter if you need something to monitor containers on there. And then again, you can run that even in your Kubernetes infrastructure as well. I should say the other, good way my, so the other thing is that you also don't need to modify the containers to do that. So I said 5, but everybody likes a bonus, Jonas, so we'll cover a 6th one. And I'll go a little bit old school here. This is not a new tool by any means, but it's called GL-tail, so as in OpenGL. And the idea here is very, very simple. If you can SSH into a thing and you can tail a file, you can get a OpenGL visualization of it. So in this case, this is just the author's visualization. He's just SSHing into his web server and then looking at his traffic as it flows across the screen. So if you need a simple way to impress your boss, like maybe you have a new boss and you need a simple way to impress your boss, just find a really busy file somewhere that you can SSH into and just pull this up on your monitor every time he goes by, and you'll have a duly impressed boss for sure. It's really great. I used it a long time ago. I think there's even I think I wrote a plugin to do it for network firewall logs, that kind of stuff. So it's super easy to modify too. So if it's not just web servers, really is literally anything you can tail. You can have it end up in a visualization like that. So this is, again, is a preview of work that Mozilla is considering doing for 2019, along with some recommended open source projects to take for a spin. If you'd like to help, we'd love some feedback on problems or solutions. So if you want, you can help me with this crazy catalog idea. Either flush it out whether it is a good idea or a bad idea, or you can help me get it off the ground from a director level sort of code into some actual user interface sort of level code. If you like the tool just as is, you can start adding stuff to it, help sort of crowdsource some inventory, tag some stuff, give some ideas about that. And if you are in need in 2019, consider an open source project. There's a whole bunch of them that we covered during the course of here. People are definitely using open source. Now you know which ones are in use, which ones are actually useful, and you've got yourself a roadmap for 2019. So with that, I thank you very much. And since I couldn't do a demo, we got lots of time for questions. So are there questions? Yes? Yeah, let me see if I can get this. Yeah, I can't see my screen here. Hang on, let me. No, so at the bottom there is the address. So it's just jeffbryner.com/bsides PDX 2018 is the address for the. So if you go there to the slides, there's also speaker notes. You can replay everything I just said. And I guess since we're here, actually, I could do this demo thing now that I got it written up there. So this is the actual app itself. So this is the address for the app. It's at catalogsecurity.alazam.org. Alazam is Mozilla spelled backwards. It's our development site. Sure. Let's see. No, I can't. There's literally just catalog.security.alazam.org. It's also in the list. But what I will demo quickly is so this is this code written in Meteor, which if you're not familiar with Meteor, it's one of my favorite tools. Mostly because so what I want you to notice is the top line there where it says Siphon SIM triage system. So I've got this same address on my phone. I'm going to type in a thing, and you're going to see. Me type. So the Meteor is a tool that does sort of reactive. Maybe you're going to see me type. Oh man, nothing's working for me. Demo failure. I've never had a demo fail before. I don't know what to do. Anyways, what's supposed to happen is that you would see. Whatever I typed in there show up in real time, but Meteor's failing me today. Anyways, but that's the address for the catalog of open source security solutions. So, anyway. Oh yeah, sorry, I'll just pull it up here. It's just jeffbryner.com, BSides PDX 2018. Oh, okay, yeah, it's probably tweeted also by now. Any other questions?
What do you think about Microsoft owning GitHub now?
Microsoft owning GitHub. Yeah, that's an interesting question. What to think about Microsoft owning GitHub? Yeah, I don't know what to think. It's a real conundrum, right? It's like, oh yeah, it is a bit of a mind job, especially for a company like Mozilla that obviously is so invested. We got almost 2,000 repos on there. Like we're not moving anytime soon. We do have to compete and get along with Microsoft, and compete and get along with Google, and compete and get along with a lot of people at the same time. Yeah, so the internet's a collaborative place. I'll say that. Yes, sir.
Y'all deployed any open source security tools at Mozilla?
We have. The question was, have we deployed open source security tools at Mozilla? Yes, we're kind of in the same category. So Zeek is a big one for us. So is Suricata as well. Michal Brzezinski on my team has done a bunch of presentations on what we've got is like a 40 gigabit per second infrastructure just built on commodity hardware that does all that kind of packet capturing, reporting, and all that stuff. as well as we've written some other tools. So MIG is a client-side solution that we've written that takes privacy into account. So it never retrieves anything off the endpoint system. We can just kind of ask it questions. Hey, are there systems out there that have a file that matches this hash? It'll just answer yes or no. It doesn't actually get the file from those systems. So it's maybe a unique case for us. I don't know other companies have that same sort of problem, but definitely a problem that we have. And then MozDev, our SIM, is probably the one that we rely on the most. So all that information comes back into to do vulnerability management, incident response, alerting, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So yeah, we're all about deploying open source. And then Audit D, of course, kind of like the Falco stuff is across all of our Linux environment to report back everything on there, which is super useful. It's really nice to be able to just have every command, every run on every Linux server ever at your fingertips. So yeah. Other questions? Okay, great. Thanks very much. Thank you.